Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist finishing up 2 years of teaching at UC Berkeley before returning home to the Rocky Mountains to CU Boulder in fall 2017. I'm back with another video about a topic in Norse language and myth, and what I want to address in this video is a common question, or maybe I should say accusation, that I get. Sometimes I'll say something on one of these videos on this channel, or even in my book, in my translation of the Poetic Edda, and say that, Njordr is the god of the sea, or that Odin is the god of poetry. And then someone might say to me, well, aren't you being wrong? Aren't you ignoring that Bragi is actually the god of poetry, or that Agir is actually the god of the sea? Well, what I actually regret is that these god of or goddess of designations are so useless in a sense. I mean, I'm as guilty of using them as anyone, probably. It's simply easier to remember Njordr, god of the sea, than it is to remember Njordr, powerful figure in the pantheon of the gods, one of the Vanir, associated in some way with the sea, right? These designations do help us remember people and remember some distinct facts about them. But, I mean, let's consider transferring this to human beings. Would you call me man of Old Norse? I mean, that's already a pretty awkward way of putting it. It certainly encapsulates that I have some association with Old Norse, that I'm engaged with Old Norse in some way. But what if someone else were to find some other guy among the thousands that have PhDs in Old Norse stuff and say, no, this is the man of Old Norse? Well, are they right? And are you wrong for calling me the man of Old Norse? Or what if someone comes along and says, no, this lady who has a PhD in Old Norse stuff, she is the woman of Old Norse. There's no man of Old Norse, there's only the woman of Old Norse. Well, does everyone have a point, or is everyone just kind of confused? There can be lots of people who are engaged with Old Norse. I mean, you can be engaged with it by reading it, you can be engaged with it by teaching it, or whatever. But, I mean, just calling someone the something of Old Norse isn't actually that informative. I mean, all it tells you is that they probably spend their Friday nights alone. So, similarly, saying that someone is the god of the sea just tells you, well, there's some association with the sea that's there in Norse myth, but it doesn't tell you anything specific about their powers, and it doesn't preclude somebody else being associated with the sea too. I think that a lot of times what's going on is that we try to over-systematize Norse myth, and other kinds of mythology too. You know, a lot of times people are working from a Christian or post-Christian vantage point, and Christianity has a very systematic, organized way of looking at theological matters, whereas pre-Christian native religions of Europe and elsewhere typically aren't that systematized. They're typically passed on in oral variants that can have a lot of difference from place to place and generation to generation. And you know, I'm not sure that the question, who is the real god of the sea, would have meant something to a Viking. It did mean something probably to Snorri. Now, when we consider our different sources of Norse myth, let's remember that our two major sources, there's the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, are actually pretty different from each other. The Poetic Edda is a compilation of poems, many of which probably do date back in their oral composition to the Viking Age, whereas Snorri Sturluson, writing the Prose Edda, is in a sense in the same position as we are. He's a Christian after the time when these gods were worshipped, trying to reconstruct some facts about them, but of course influenced by his own ideas and by the ambient religion of his time. And so Snorri may say that someone is god of something, but this could easily just be him trying to over-systematize too. So let's look a little bit first at some of the ways that you know, the notion that someone is god of or goddess of whatever comes about. One way is, of course, through Kennings. Now, I have another video where I've talked about Old Norse poetry and how it works. It was actually a lot of fun to do, kind of did like an instruction manual for Norse poetry. And I talked about Kennings, which are these, you know, these elaborate, interesting ways of renaming something through some kind of metaphor or extended meanings of words. And often they're used because a Norse poet needs to alliterate or rhyme a word that the normal word for that thing wouldn't alliterate or rhyme with. So for instance, I might want to talk about Odin but I need something to alliterate with age, I might choose one of these two Kennings for him. Now notice here, as everywhere in my videos, I'm going to be using reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation, not modern Icelandic pronunciation. I've got a video about that. I'll link in the top right corner. And there's many other videos on this channel that talk about why I pronounce things the way I do, how to pronounce things the modern Icelandic way too, that you can watch, or you can just be angry at me, either way. So, Kennings for Odin include Hrafnos, which is just raven god, or Hangatur, the hanging god, god of hanged people. And there's many others. There's also Gersdrotin, the lord of the spear, for instance. There's Farmer Golga, there's the load, the burden of the hanging tree. But these all speak to some aspect of Odin's character without necessarily telling you, oh, he is definitively the god of X, not the god of this other thing Y, and nobody else can be the god of that X. So, Hrafnos, raven god. Does that mean Odin is the god of ravens? I feel like that's kind of a stretch. Odin is definitely associated with ravens, but god of ravens sounds like a figure who's associated with ravens and not much else, somebody who can maybe summon ravens or something like that. Hangatir, god of the hanged. Certainly Odin is associated with hanging. Sacrifice appears to have been made to him by hanging. Odin sacrificed himself to himself by hanging. But this only tells you a little bit about his character. It doesn't tell you very much. It's like saying that, you know, I'm the guy who wears a lot of dark blue. I mean, it could help you recognize me maybe on the street, but it's not going to tell you that much about my inner character. So these kennings can be interesting illustrations about points about the gods that can tell us about them, but we shouldn't make them limit how we think about the gods. And then, speaking of kennings and then also heiti, elusive alternative names for things, Snorri takes a lot of these and probably over-interprets them in his prose Edda. There are many different heiti or alternative names for different gods. So for instance, Thor can be called Hlorriði, he can be called Fjörgyn, Odin can be called Thunder, Grimnir, and 100 other things. And the same thing goes with the goddesses. And it looks like in the prose Edda, Snorri feels like he hasn't listed enough goddesses maybe, and he uses some of the heiti that probably apply to one of the main goddesses, to Frigg or Froya, maybe to Siv or Skadi, and then makes different goddesses out of them, even though there's no evidence elsewhere in Norse myth that these are actually separate figures. So sometimes because I don't mention these goddesses, people say, well, you're ignoring all these goddesses from Norse myth. I'm not. I just think that Snorri is making characters out of what are just alternative names for goddesses that we already know about. So he mentions, for instance, Eir, who's supposed to be a great healer. He mentions Sjovan, who's supposed to be sort of associated with love. Sometimes people will tell me this is the Norse goddess of love, even though she's never mentioned except in this list by Snorri. There's Loven, who's associated with facilitating love that's been banned or blocked in some way. This is the goddess of Romeo and Juliet stories. There's Vor, who's supposed to be very watchful. Her name literally is just the feminine form of the adjective that means aware or watchful. There's Sin, who has to do with keeping people out of doorways. Her name is related to a word for denial. There's Hlin, who is supposed to be helping people escape danger. There's Snoltra, who's supposed to be very wise. And then there's Gnol, who's supposed to be kind of an errand woman for the goddesses. Again, there's actually nothing except for Snorri's list of goddesses that suggests that any of these goddesses were ever worshipped. They're probably just alternative names for one of the goddesses that's actually mentioned in our narratives. Someone like Froya, Frigg, Skadi, Ron, Siv, etc. And there's actually probably only 7, 8 goddesses that really come up. Another couple I'd name would be Fula and Gevjon. I mean, we would love to have more information about these goddesses if they were out there, but it seems kind of unlikely that since they're not mentioned in other poems, except seemingly in heiti and kennings for the major goddesses, that these actually were separate goddesses. So we have to watch out for that, watch out for Snorri sort of over-including and over-interpreting. And then we also have to keep in mind that scholars have long been aware of the so-called Interpretatio Germanica. So this is where the Greco-Roman gods are interpreted as having equivalence from the Germanic, or more specifically Norse pantheon of gods. And then those equivalents can be used to over-interpret the similarities. So our days of the week, of course, are named for these Germanic gods who have very close cognates in the Norse tradition. There's Tiu, which is cognate with Tyr. There's Woden or Waden in Old English, it's cognate with Odin. There's Thonor in Old English, it's cognate with Thor. There's Freya in Old English, it's cognate with Frigg. And then these Norse or Germanic deities were considered at some early point in the history of writing these languages equivalent to the Roman gods, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. So, for instance, since Tyr, who is not really mentioned all that much in our surviving sources, is equated with Mars in the system, right? French Mardi, Tuesday is English Tuesday, day of Tiu or Tyr. People overinterpret that and make Tyr into a, quote, god of war like Mars. But we have to remember that in our sources in the Old Norse language, there's not really very much to speak to Tyr being a god of war. But this can sort of beg the question and make people look for evidence of it. And for instance, Snorri says when he's introducing Tyr that he is not known as a reconciler of men. He is ekki satirmana. This may be based on comments like we see in Lokasenna, where Loki insults Tyr and says that he cannot bera tilt med tveim. This literally just means carry well with two. Snorri seems to have interpreted this as meaning something about you can't reconcile two conflicting parties. But Tyr is one-handed. This may just mean that he can't carry well with two hands. So, we may be over-interpreting Loki's insult. I think in general, over-interpretation can be a big theme of problems with interpreting Norse myths, as you'll see from me using that word again and again here. Another case, of course, is the god of the sea. Let's consider the two gods that are usually called that. There's Njordr and there's Aegir, and Aegir has his wife, Ron. Neither one of these gods is actually called anything like God of the Sea in the poems of the Poetic Edda. In fact, if you just read the Poetic Edda, it wouldn't be that easy to get their association with the sea out of it. Njordr is usually mentioned in association with this, quote, high-timbered hall, Noatun, which, being high-timbered, doesn't seem to be particularly associated with the sea. And Aegir is mostly seen in the Poetic Edda as the host of the gods' feasts. He's the MC of Asgard. It's mostly Snorri in the Prose Edda that tells us about their association with the sea. For instance, he says that Njordr controls the wind and the sea, although he says it kind of in passing. And then Aegir, Snorri tells us, and we do see in some poems, his name can actually stand in as a Haiti for the ocean or the sea. And he is married to Ron, who is said to take those who die at sea in her fishing net. And they have 9 daughters, whose names all are associated with waves or the sea. So, sure, these are both potentially, quote, god of the sea, but does calling one god of the sea and saying that the other one isn't actually mean anything? Does it help us understand our actual surviving Norse sources? I don't think so. I think it puts us into too much of it puts us into a corner. It just begs the question, and then we're not necessarily actually investigating our medieval sources. We're trying to make our medieval sources fit our modern perceptions and sometimes fantasies. Well, I hope this has been somewhat useful and informative for you. And if you're interested in Norse myth, I hope you'll check out some other videos on my channel that concern the gods, the Eddas, etc., as well as our sources of Norse myth and the Norse language itself. I also hope that you'll take a look at my books. I've translated the Poetic Edda that I've mentioned several times here, as well as the Saga of the Volsungs and the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. That latter book will be available in September, or actually, I'm hearing now, August 2017. From the University of California, Berkeley, I'm wishing you all the best.